So this is the third in the series of webinars, and it's all around risk. And for me, risk is probably one of the most important but often overlooked aspects of governance within voluntary and community organisations. And the reason that I'm quite passionate about it is in my other day job, one of the things that I do is go in and try and support organisations where things have gone terribly wrong, and hopefully kind of rescue them or look at a planned exit or something like that. And 9 times out of 10, there are things that have happened to that charity where they have a perception that they came out of the blue, but in actual fact, had they been horizon scanning and had they been considering risk actively at board level and staff level, I would argue that in many situations, people have got time to predict potential risks, scenario plan for them, manage them and mitigate them. So today's going to be about that. It's going to be about identifying risks. You can't stop some risks. You know, there are going to be some risks that come. You know, we couldn't have predicted COVID, for example. But being able to scenario plan and say, you know, how would we deal with these crises if they came to us is a key part of risk management. I want to talk about that today. Apologise. So let's have a look at the first slide then. So why is risk management essential? The earlier you identify a risk, the more options you've got to manage it, avoid it or minimise its impact. And I always use the analogy, if you're in a field and there's a bull, and let's suppose you're wearing all red, and there's a bull in this field and the bull is right at the other end of the field, and it's got its head down and it is grazing and it's not looking at you, you would probably assess that actually there's very little risk to you from that bull at that time. However, you have to keep looking over and checking what's happening with the bull, because at some point the bull might stop eating and it might lift its head up and it might start looking at you, and the next thing is it might start moving towards you. And if you don't keep an eye on it, all of a sudden you're eyeball to eyeball with a bull. You've got very few options. Whereas if you'd started looking while it was still over there, the further away it was, the more options that you've got. So risk has got to be done from a whole organisation point of view, and particularly the board should be constantly horizon scanning and saying, you know, what are the risks and how can we manage them? And one of the things that I'm also going to talk about, which often gets missed when we talk about risk, is management of assumptions. Management of assumptions are a key risk, particularly in the charity sector. And an assumption is something that you continue with the assumption that it is going to be, that this is going to be the case. So, for example, if the local authority have given you a grant of £30,000 for the last 10 years, you might say, oh, well, you know, we're going to put it into the cash flow because they pay us every year, you know, and account for it. But if you're not checking, you know, if you're not saying to the local authority, can I just check, is this still in the budget this year? Or are there any policy changes? Is there any way in which that funding could be at risk? If you don't ask those questions and then suddenly they say, I'm sorry, you know, we've got a different focus this year, or you know, we're gonna halve our grants, then at the point at which you find that out, you've got very little manoeuvrability. So always look at things that you rely on and say, you know, is that a fact or is it an assumption? And largely, risks can be broken down into 4 different categories. The first category is financial risks, and that can be things like funding cuts, excessive spend, fraud, unplanned costs. So financial risks are a key area for risk within charitable organisations. And again, being proactive, checking, how secure is funding, always reviewing your spend, always reviewing your costs is really, really important. A number of times when I've gone into organisations where all of a sudden, we found that they've been insolvent, they've been trading while insolvent, and they hadn't realised that they were insolvent, then one of the things that we realised was the level of monthly payments that were going out that had been unchecked. So I do apologise for the background noise. It's my dog's having a bit of a moment. So things like subscriptions to publications, window cleaners that you don't need, water coolers. We see less of those now, but in actual fact, at one point, I went into an organisation that was insolvent, and every week they were being brought great big gallon drums of water. There were 25 of them piled up, and there were no staff in that building, and yet they kept being delivered. So financial management is really, really important. Reputational risk is another one that's often missed, and these are the kinds of things where people start talking about you, and social media and Twitter and things like that. So a couple of ways in which we would suggest that you monitor that is Google Alerts is one of the simplest ways. So a Google alert that says, if ever our organisation is named online, we want to know about it, because if something bad is being, if something good's being said, great, you can share it. But if something bad is being said, you need to be able to know about it and look at it. And also recognising things like, staff that have left, or beneficiaries who maybe aren't happy, maybe looking to gripe. So managing your reputation, I think, is a really, really important aspect of risk that's often missed. Operational risks are probably the ones that people think about, and that's things like service disruptions. What would you do? Luckily now most of our servers are in the cloud, but the number of times, organizations where the servers there in the print room, if someone stole it or the building burnt down, all your documents were on that. That used to present a huge risk. But again, what would happen if you could no longer operate from one of your key buildings? And having a disaster recovery plan is often a really useful thing for an organisation. So if all of a sudden we couldn't deliver from a building, what would we do? And have a plan in place for that. Then governance and compliance risks, and that can be anything from safeguarding, health and safety breaches, breach of the Charity Act and Companies Act and GDPR, all things where there is a potential of either legal action, or again, this can bounce on and be reputational risk. And the kinds of ways that you manage that is making sure that the board in particular are well trained, that they know what the law what the law says in those areas, in things like equalities and inclusion and things like that, and also that you have that professional support if you need it. So 4 key categories of risk: financial, reputational, operational, and governance and compliance risks. So obviously it's a webinar today. We're not going to do it's not an interactive session, but if you want to, at the end of the webinar, go away and go through the case studies and look at these activities, then I'd encourage you to do so, because I think sometimes being able to look at an example and work through that is often easier than working in hypotheticals. So the case study that I've included for this area is one that didn't have a formal risk register, and it was a small charity who assumed that only large organisations needed one. Now, a risk register is absolutely vital in all organisations, because what that does is it says these are all our risks, but it also says how big a risk are they, because one of the challenges is that You can have risks which I would call big and shouty, where the impact is quite low, and yet the board and the organisation spend a disproportionate amount of time on those risks where the impact might be quite small, and they don't look at risks where there is a high impact or a high likelihood of that risk being realised. So a risk register, what that does is say, this is all our risks. This is all our risks. This is our assessment of those risks. This is who owns them. And this is the steps we're taking to mitigate them. And it's such a simple process, but really good for focusing the mind. And I always advise board members to have a standard agenda item of risk that is there for every board meeting where you review the risk register. So within this case study, they didn't have a risk register, and therefore they weren't thinking about, what are the big risks facing us. And then all of a sudden, a long-term funder suddenly withdrew funding. And again, when we talked about management of assumptions, that's a key area there. They also had a safeguarding complaint made against a volunteer, but there wasn't a process for handling it. And the difficulty is that when things like that hit, if you haven't got a process, if you haven't got a policy in place, people panic. People get really worried, they get very stressed about it. And if you've got a policy and a procedure for things such as a safeguarding complaint, which you should have anyway by law if you're dealing with children or vulnerable adults, then it's much easier to say, right, what's the process? Let's follow the process. So in this case study, what did they do in order to respond to that? Well, the first thing is they conducted a full risk assessment to identify all the risks that were relative to their organisation. And they introduced a risk register to track and review risks. And then they trained staff and volunteers on recognising and reporting support safeguarding concerns. So again, there were some real lessons there, which ideally, if they'd had those policies and procedures in place and a risk register, wouldn't have been such a crisis, but great that they've responded positively. So again, we're not going to do this as part of the webinar now, but if you're wanting to use this not just as an informative session, but you do want to use the activity in order to be able to reflect on your own organisation, then it's worth taking time to look at what are the top 3 risks in your organisation. And if you don't know, I'd say that's a risk. So if you don't know what your top 3 risks are, then there's a piece of work to do there to say, what are the biggest hitters here? And remember, if you use a RAG rating model, which is red, amber, green, you assess a risk on 2 different criteria. One is the likelihood is that risk could happen, and the other is the impact if that risk were realised. And if you have high likelihood, high impact, then you're looking at a red risk. It's a big risk, it needs an owner and it needs dealing with. Sometimes you might have something, let's say that you do activities out in the countryside. You might have something on there that says somebody could get bitten by an adder. Now, getting bitten by an adder is a pretty iffy thing to happen, but as long as you've got a procedure in place to kind of get people to hospital, the thing is that the likelihood of somebody being bitten by an adder, unless you're really in a certain area, is very low. Therefore, again, it's not going to be red because the likelihood is going to be minimal. And then thinking about what would your organisation be prepared if a major funder pulled out tomorrow. And if you're wanting to be really proactive about risk, particularly financial risk, I would be looking at my income framework, my income profile, and say, are we overly dependent on one particular funder? Because if you are, even if they haven't said that they're going to pull, that is a risk. So looking at, where does your funding come from? Or does all your activity and staff rely on that particular funding in order for you to be able to operate? So again, if you wanted to do this as an interactive session, these are things for you to kind of think about and reflect on. So in addition to a risk register, which is in a sense an Excel spreadsheet with lots of nice colours on it, you can put together a risk management plan, and what that does is says, how are we going to manage these risks? And again, if you look at it, it has very much the headings of a risk assessment, but it says, what are the identifying our risks, assessing the likelihood and impact. Remember the RAG rating, how likely it is that it's going to happen, and what the impact would be if it was realised. And developing mitigation strategies. I've regularly met organisations that have done the first two, but then stopped. If you have identified a risk, if you don't and you've assessed it, if you don't then go on to actively manage it, it won't stop it being realised, and nor will it assist you in being able to respond positively to it. So mitigation strategies are really important. And I would suggest that if you have risks, particularly operational risks that might be team specific, to involve teams in them. So don't just leave it as a board activity, but can we involve the staff in this? You know, what would we do if? And let the staff be involved in developing the mitigation strategies. And there's a number of reasons for that. The first is that staff have probably got a unique insight that you don't have, and therefore might be able to come up with some really interesting ways of mitigating risk. And the other thing is that it's about sharing the ownership, because risk identification, risk realisation and risk management has got to be a whole organisation strategy. If everyone continues as if, you know, we're in la-la land, and if there's a problem, well, that's for the board, then you're limiting the opportunity to be able to identify and proactively respond to risk at the earliest point. Assigning responsibilities. My argument would always be that if you have a red risk, so a risk which is high likelihood, high impact, that it has an owner within the board, because it is significant and could have a significant impact on the organisation. However, the responsibility for mitigating or removing that risk might be with a number of people, or a senior manager, or the CEO, or something like that. But it's no good, you know, the royal we're going to do that, we're going to sort this out. That's not how it works. Somebody's got to be responsible, even if they're only responsible for monitoring it and checking it and making sure that people are doing something about it. And the other is reviewing and updating regularly. Another common thing that I find is beautifully turned out risk assessments with the RAG ratings and all the lovely colours and everything, but it hasn't been updated for 3 years. These are not static. They're not static. They are something that will it is dynamic and is moving all the time, and therefore it regularly needs to be updated. And there's some guidance in the packs of downloads on building a risk management plan, if people are interested in doing that. Increasingly, I think we've got organisations, obviously, that work within the field of social care, that work with people who are vulnerable, people with complex needs, children, vulnerable adults. But increasingly, even the organisations that don't primarily support people with complex needs, community organisations, a whole range of organisations now can often find themselves having to manage and support somebody or an incident with somebody who presents as vulnerable. And therefore, whilst, you know, if you work in the field of domestic abuse or drug and alcohol, you know, recovery services, then the likelihood is you're pretty homed in on things like safeguarding. The organisations that can often fall foul are those that don't always work with people who are vulnerable or have complex needs. So if you're wanting to look at this from an example point of view, again, we've got Safe Haven, which is the case study for a homelessness charity. Didn't have a plan in place for when funding was lost, so they didn't have a funding strategy. And in today's environment, funding strategies are essential. So if the only time you start looking for funding is when your last lot of funding is virtually about to go, one of the key challenges there is retaining staff, because if staff have got no surety that there's going to be money to pay their wages after a certain point, then they're going to start looking elsewhere. And again, with this one and the case study, safeguarding being handled informally. And this is quite common, because if you don't train staff properly around safeguarding, there can often be a reluctance for staff to disclose a potential safeguarding risk, because of the fear that if it's wrong, that they're going to have done somebody a lot of damage. You know, that they reputationally they could have damaged either a member of staff or a volunteer or another service user, and you can't do that with safeguarding. So what the training and the policy does is it says, do you know what, we're not leaving it to your discretion, you have to do this. So it helps people, because it's a case of, if someone says this or I witnessed that, I have to do this. So having a strong policy, having strong procedures and having training takes the discretion out of it, and that's really valuable for staff who are very reluctant to kind of make that kind of disclosure. And again, we've talked about the risk management framework and the likelihood and the mitigation. And with Safe Haven, what they did was they also made sure that risk was discussed at every board meeting. Another tactic that I use to ensure that risk is seen as part of everybody's duties is support organisations to create reporting templates for staff. So generally you would expect the CEO and perhaps the ops manager to write a report for the board. And the quality of that report is going to be largely dependent on their confidence in writing reports, and the board clearly communicating to senior managers, this is what I want. One of the ways in which I've supported organisations to make sure that things like risk are a much clearer focus within board meetings is asking staff, giving staff a template and saying, right, can you complete this? This is, this is the activity that I've been undertaking in the last month. This is the contribution towards our strategic goals and objectives. These are things that have been a real success that I want to share with the board. These are the things that haven't worked so well. These are the risks. So you have a reporting template which has something in it that every staff member who provides a report to the board has a section on risk. And that way you're saying it's okay to talk about risk, because the real risk is where staff feel that their responsibility is to deliver a positive, happy, clappy report to the board every time, even when things aren't right. So reporting templates where you give the information that the board needs is a really valuable way of making sure that risk stays on the agenda. So again, if you were looking at this webinar from the point of view of using it as an activity to do with staff to go through the process and do some learning, is to question whether you have a risk management plan or a risk register or both, and are your risks formally documented and reviewed. If they're not, then I would say that's a real priority, even if you're a small organisation. And if a crisis occurred tomorrow, would your staff or volunteers know what to do? And I use the example of, you know, when we have fire drills. We don't have a fire drill because we're expecting in the next 10 minutes that there's going to be a fire, so we just need to be really alert. You have fire drills not expecting that there will ever be a fire. But the importance of a fire drill is familiarity, that if that alarm does go off and there is a fire, people have moved out of the building without being in a state of terror and assembled where they know they assemble, and somebody's taken a clipboard and somebody has known what to do. And all risk followed the same process. If you say, if this risk was to be realised, what would we do? How can we plan for it? Because by being able to plan for it, you're in a much better position to be able to say to people, look, you know what, we thought this might happen, we've got a plan A, we've got a plan B, we want to involve you in it. Policies and procedures. In your pack, I've given you a huge list of policies. Each one of those policies at some point touch risk, but it doesn't mean that as a small organisation you need to have this huge raft of policies and procedures. It's for you to look at them. You're better to have a smaller suite of policies and procedures that everyone knows and that are embedded into practice than some huge great tome that nobody knows what's in there and nobody applies it. The key ones though that you really would have is a safeguarding policy. And bear in mind what I said, of course if you work with children, of course if you work with vulnerable adults or people with complex needs, then you would have a safeguarding policy. But what's to say that you don't come up against a safeguarding issue at nit and natter, or you know, something like that, where somebody says something that triggers a thought that actually there's someone vulnerable here and I need to make a safeguarding disclosure. So regardless of who you support in your organisation, I would argue safeguarding is absolutely key. Data protection and GDPR, the number of charities that have said, oh, well, I don't need to be registered with the Information Commissioner because I'm a charity. No, you do. You absolutely do. Because people have got a right, if you hold their data, to have that data held and processed securely and within the law. And you need to know what to do if somebody asks you for it. Health and safety is a huge one. And you know, there are boards of charities that have been taken to court for breaches of health and safety where there's been negligence. So that, you know, it's a compliance issue with real risk, with real legal ramifications. HR policies are really important, including equality, diversity and inclusion. And it's really difficult for boards particularly that don't have an HR background, that sometimes when things go wrong, when people put in grievances or you're forced to look at capability or conduct, it's very easy for boards to get quite emotional about that and feel quite personal about it. And you can't afford to. It's a process. And when I started doing HR quite a few years ago, an HR solicitor in Newport, in Gwent, gave me the best advice that I've ever had in relation to HR. And she said, follow the process. That's what you do. You follow the process. And it is really important because, you know, often board members will say, well, I can't understand, you know, we've always treated them well. Why are they doing this? And get really angry and upset. And it doesn't help the situation. So having your HR policies, having someone with an HR background in the organisation or buying in that expertise is of huge value, because HR is one of the big risks, I think, to organisations if you employ staff. EDI, you know, equality, diversity and inclusion, still really, it's really, really important. It's important from a legal compliance point of view, but it's also really, really important from the perspective of reflecting and recognising the community that you serve. So this is not, you know, this is not something to just think, oh, you know, let's have an equality policy and stick it under E in the filing cabinet. Equality and diversity says a lot about your values as an organisation. And then whistleblowing. And, you know, people think of whistleblowing as being, you know, huge corporates and, you know, the NHS and things like that. But if you have a staff member that sees something that really isn't right, you want them to have the confidence to be able to say, hang on a minute, we shouldn't be doing that. Or we should, you know, this shouldn't be happening. This is a health and safety risk, or this is a, because if they don't and something happens, it's the board that are liable. So what a whistleblowing policy does, it's not designed to make snitches of staff. It's designed to give staff confidence that if they see something that's wrong, that they'll be protected. So I think that, again, whistleblowing is often misunderstood and people don't realise that it actually protects organisations. And if someone makes a whistleblowing complaint and it's not legitimate, that's fine. It will be seen and would be seen as such. So again, you've got a full list of policies, and I know you know, Medrwn also helps support with policies and procedures for organisations, so that's definitely worth having a look at. This idea that it's common sense until it's not, and I always say to people, write policies when the sun's shining. Don't write them for the rainy days because it's too late. Things like conflict of interest, code of conduct, particularly with boards. You know, people say, oh, well, you know, we all get on as a board. Well, that's great. But if ever you don't, if you haven't got a code of conduct and you haven't applied it, how are you going to manage that? So things like policies and procedures, don't rely on common sense. There's two reasons. One is it takes the discretion out for staff, which often protects them, that they can say, well, I can't do that because it's against the policy, rather than them feeling that they're obliged to do something. Verbal agreements are a huge risk, and they're inconsistent. Not having a data protection policy, and again, this refers back to the case study, is a huge risk. Financial controls. One of the things with financial controls and making decisions that is very useful, and it's not in your pack, but I'm sure Medrwn would have one of these, and if not, then I also have a model that we can provide, is what they call a scheme of delegation. Now, if you're a really, really small organisation, schemes of delegation, it can be, you know, written on one sheet of paper. But if you're a larger organisation, sitting down and specifying who can make which decisions need to go to the board, which decisions are made by the CEO or the senior managers, which can project staff make, you know, what are the decisions volunteers can make. A scheme of delegation is a really, really clear way of enabling people to make decisions. And where I saw that was really needed was that that the staff had employed a CEO who was very passionate about the organisation and wanting to do the right thing. What they didn't have were fundraising skills and particularly being able to cost projects accurately. And they put quite a few funding bids in. I think they put 6 funding bids in, all of which were successful, none of which were financially viable, and the board hadn't seen them. And the problem with that is you think, oh, it's great, we've got the money, but that's a contract. You're entering into a contract with the funder. You're saying to the funder, we'll deliver all this good stuff and you pay us this amount of money. And if you've not properly costed it, they're still going to expect you to deliver that. So I would often say to organisations, bids over, say, £5,000 have to go to the board, and the board have to sign it off, because in effect it's a contract. You wouldn't expect a staff member to go and sign up for a contract for a printer, for a lease, or a minibus, or a building. You know, that would come to the board Large funding bids are also contracts, and again, I think it's really important that that the board are able to see that actually this all stacks up and it's reasonable. And volunteer agreements are really important as well. Some people, people like volunteering because it gives them a level of flexibility, and they can often do far more than they would, the breadth of range of what they do, far more than they would actually if they were employed. But that also has to be boundaried. It has to be boundaried, first of all, to prevent burnout, but also thinking about delegated power and responsibilities. You have very little control over volunteers in terms of legislation, and therefore volunteer agreements and volunteer role descriptions are really good for saying, right, well, this is your role, this is how many hours a week we would expect you to undertake as part of that work. Here's who will support and supervise you, those kind of things. It's all about having that in place, which I think is really quite useful. And again, if you go back and want to do this as an interactive, the case study, Hopehaven implemented core policies, data protection, financial management, and clear spending approval processes, which are really, really important. Volunteer agreements, and then policies are clear and accessible with annual refresher training, and I think that that's really important. The number of times I've said, well, we've got policies but the staff haven't seen them. Well, how can you expect them to abide by them if they've never seen them? Not only should they see them, but a great way of doing it is for staff meetings to introduce one policy at each staff meeting, just go through it, edited highlights, and ask the staff, anybody got any questions? And then, so you do that, you schedule that for every staff meeting. We'll look at one policy, just check in, everybody knows about it and what the, what the ramifications are. And obviously holding them centrally so that people can access them and download them if they need to. So again, if you want to reflect on this, thinking about written policies of your own, and also whether they are up to date and regularly reviewed, and do volunteers and staff know where to find them. And if you want to start somewhere, start with one essential policy and think, get it out. Who should know about it? Who does know about it? How will I make sure that we embed this into practice? Crisis management and resilience planning. The crisis management work that I do is probably the work that gives me the most reward, even though it's generally very, very scary at first, and people are, feeling really panicked and feeling out of control. And there are a number of things that provide an approach for crisis management and resilience planning. So the first thing is not to panic, and that's really easy to say and less easy to do, because once things start to go wrong, they tend to have a dynamism of their own, and their own momentum. But the first thing is to assess how much of this is really scary and how much of it is hot air, and pick out the bits that really are critical. What are the critical issues that we're facing here? Because it's likely that lots of other things will almost like magnetic bolt themselves on to make it look much bigger and hairier and scarier. So you need to assess it. What is the crisis here? What's the real thing that we're dealing with? The next thing to do is pull a team together that will lead. Now, what sometimes happens is that senior leadership teams or boards say, we don't want anyone to know because it will just scare them. Believe me, they know. They'll know. They'll know by the amount of coffee you're drinking that something's not right. So the idea that people don't know, but if you bring people together as part of the solution and manage what you tell them, but you bring them together and you say, right, this is the team we're going to lead. What are we going to do? Then I think that that's really, really important, and engaging people in that is really, really important. The next is a comm strategy, and I use this in every single crisis piece of work that I do, and that is own the narrative. What that means is you want to be the one that's putting out what's happening and what is going to happen and how you're going to tackle it. You don't want to leave that to rumour and speculation and conspiracy. And there is a narrative within the organisation. What are we going to tell the staff? What are we going to tell the volunteers? What are we going to tell beneficiaries? And also, what are we going to tell our external partners, our funders, our stakeholders, key people? So be very clear, what is the narrative, what is the message, and stick to it. It's so important, because otherwise other people will be defining what your crisis is for you. The next thing to do is to implement immediate actions, and this is the bit I find that most people struggle with, because sometimes people want to know all the answers. They want to know everything before they make a decision, and in a crisis you often can't do that. You have to make a decision based on what you know, and be prepared to monitor it and review it. And remember, not taking any action is also a decision. It's just a decision not to do anything. So implement actions, but be ready to monitor, manage and review them. And then obviously once the crisis is under control, it's about recovery and moving away from that. You need that, because that gives stability, it gives confidence to the staff, it gives confidence to beneficiaries, and it gives confidence to your stakeholders. Again, just referring back to the case study, the Hope Haven case study, the example they had is that a client collapsed at a support group and staff panicked because there was no emergency procedure. So what they did, well, obviously they dealt with that they dealt with that the client, and the client was taken to hospital and everything. But then they said, hang on, if this happened again, we need to be ready. We need to know what we would do, and therefore they developed a crisis response plan for different types of emergencies, and provided staff and volunteers with training on handling incidents. And again, it's just like your fire. It's just like your fire drill. If people practice, then they're less scared if they have to do it in real life. And they conducted regular drills and scenario training to ensure that confidence in crisis response was developed. And the final activity really, again, is thinking about this. What are the kinds of emergencies that could happen in your organisation? A great way to do this is at staff meetings, is to say, right, what could happen? What could happen here? And just get them all down on the board. Get them all down on a piece of flip chart, or on on post-it notes, so that what are all the things that could go wrong? What could go wrong for us? And then start looking at them and assess them like you would other risks. What are the likelihood of those, and do we have a process for doing that? And these kind of things, for procedures, for those kind of operational things, are also something really good to give to teams, give to staff teams, and say, can you come up with a procedure? How would we deal with that? And can we find some training? Because by engaging staff in that, you develop staff confidence, you give them ownership of those those situations, and you move away from this perception that all the thoughts and all the clever stuff and all the responsibility sits with the SLT. Because having sat on a lot of SLTs, having been the CEO of a number of organisations, I'm not the cleverest in the room. If you ask me to prepare a filing system and be able to retrieve it, then I wouldn't have a clue. If you asked me to, do a detailed pivot table, for, you know, as part of a cash flow forecast, I wouldn't be able to do it. So bringing people together and using their expertise develops confidence and also gives ownership within the organisation. And that's it really from the point of view of this session. You know, I'm hoping, you know, I hope that people are able to learn things from those, but you know, the key message here is being able to predict and plan for them, because if you're able to do that, then I think you're much better prepared to manage risks. I'm going to stop now.